This episode is sponsored by Path Financial. Living sustainably isn't just about the choices you make every day. It's about where your money goes too. Path Financial are award-winning, chartered independent financial advisors helping people invest with purpose in the UK. From pensions to savings and investments, Path makes sure your money supports positive change for you and for the planet. Path Financial, ethical financial advice for a brighter, more sustainable future.
I think that the Palestinian national identity has become a lot stronger because of the genocide. They were aiming for erasure, and what they actually ended up with collective self-assertion. We never felt more Palestinians, and the word Palestinian never meant to us and to the rest of the world more than what it means today.
Welcome to the World Unspun. My name is Decca Muldowney, and I'm a co-editor at New Internationalist magazine. I'm a reporter and editor, but before that, I studied and taught Palestinian literature. I'm pleased to host this week's episode and introduce the guest editor of our latest issue.
My name is Ramzy Baroud. I'm a Palestinian from Gaza, a Palestinian refugee from Gaza. I am a Palestinian historian. I have written 7 books on Palestine. I am affiliated with various universities, and I am the editor of the Palestine Chronicle.com. My family comes from a village in today's Israel, southern historic Palestine, called Beit Daras. They were expelled along with 800,000 or so Palestinians from Palestine 77 years ago, and we ended up living in Gaza. So I was born and raised in Gaza. I received much of my education in Gaza, and until I was, deported, not allowed to return to Palestine by the Israeli occupation.
This issue gives space to voices that are too often sidelined, allowing Palestinians to define their own struggle. We're proud to feature stories from Ramzy alongside politician Khalida Jarrah and feminist scholar Tahrir Hamdi, along with South African anti-apartheid struggle veteran Ronnie Casrills and renowned historian Ilan Pape. The magazine also features striking art by Gazan illustrator Ramzy Baroud and photography by Ahmed Yunus and Doa Mohammed. This issue documents genocide while amplifying Palestinian visions of liberation. It exposes the complicity of Western powers, the global arms trade, and the silencing and distortion of Palestine, while celebrating the courage of those resisting apartheid and occupation. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and you feel as inspired by this conversation as I did. Please leave us a rating and a comment with your thoughts on the episode. And if you work with an international Palestine solidarity group, we'd love to hear from you. Please do get in touch with us via the contact details in our show notes, as we have a range of resources that might be of interest to your group. Thanks for listening. Now, onto my conversation with Ramzy. So we're here to talk about this new edition of New Internationalist, which you guest edited. The title of the magazine is Gaza, Genocide and Resistance. Can you tell me about choosing that title and what story you wanted to tell with it?
Well, I was greatly honored to be the guest editor of this special big story of the New Internationalist, because it meant a lot to me, in a sense that it comes at a time that my people, I am a Palestinian first, of course, but I'm also a Gazan, and my Gazan identity is very, very strong, and it's something that I take with me everywhere I go. And for us to have experienced, essentially mass extermination is something that we, even knowing what we know about Israel, even knowing what we know about Zionism, and even living the history that we have, that of apartheid, racism, military occupation, numerous massacres, and many, many wars, we still did not expect that this could, at one point culminate to an act of total extermination of everything Palestinian in Gaza, people, buildings, infrastructure, animals, everything. So to be in a position that I am allowed to not only be given the platform, convey the voice and Palestine, or the discourse of the Palestinian people, but actually to be given the chance to create platforms for others. as well was particularly validating for me. And I really appreciated that very much. The reason that or that I chose, kind of create this kind of idea that genocide is something that doesn't define the Palestinians, meaning that genocide is something that Israel imposes on the Palestinian people. And this is something there is very little we can do about it. You can't blame victims of genocide for their genocide. You can't blame victims of colonialism and apartheid and violence for what has befallen them, not just collectively, but also at an individual level. You can't blame a victim for being a victim, but I wanted to make sure that we are not neglecting the fact that the Palestinian people are not just this passive victim. We Palestinians have always been united in our will to survive, to fight back, to defeat Zionism, to support our resistance in all of its forms. And I wanted to emphasize that, therefore, genocide and resistance. Because when you think about it logically, if only genocide existed without resistance, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now, because the whole thing would have been sorted out a long time ago. It is the word resistance there that made all the difference. And that's why the story is still being told. And that's why the global community is rising in solidarity with Gaza, is because Palestinians are resisting. And therefore that needed to be highlighted as a primary factor in this so-called conflict.
I know that it was a challenge to find an image for the cover that represents what you just described, because there are so many horrifying images of the genocide that many of us have seen over the last 2 years. But you chose something different for this cover. Can you tell me about the image that you settled on?
I think it really sums up the Palestinian struggle the way that they would have said it themselves. A group of men, most likely civil defense workers, taking break during the month of Ramadan, last Ramadan, I believe, to break their fast with very little simple food. Most likely they have had a horrific day. I mean, I have interviewed many people in Gaza for the purpose of a book I am working on, and I can tell you, I don't think there's a single Gazan who has not experienced absolute horror. If not, it's something that they experienced personally or through family members, and I think everyone did, but it's just the visual, what they have seen. And yet, at the end of the day, they would gather together, and what place do they choose? A destroyed mosque, in which the dome of the mosque is still kind of almost intact, but the entire mosque is destroyed. And for me, there was hope. There's this communal struggle, this simplicity, friends getting together, working together, fighting together, dying together, eating together, and the element of spirituality. And that's really, really important. When I say spirituality, I don't mean religion per se, because also Palestine has a large population of Christians, and the churches of Gaza, there are three or so churches where they were all destroyed and people were massacred inside. And the 1,200 mosques of Gaza were also destroyed, every single one of them. Yet somehow the idea of the mosque, the idea of the church kept bringing people together. In fact, even after the ceasefire, you still see people, they want to pray, they go to the ruins of the mosque. They want to hold some sort of a meal or, get together, do whatever. They always go to the mosque. Spirituality is very central in the way that we Palestinians perceive the world and perceive our relationship to Palestine. We are rooted in Palestine because of these symbols, because of the mosque and the church, because of the olive tree, because of the community, because of the brother and the sister and the so forth. So this is what makes Gaza beautiful. That's why Gazans don't want to leave Gaza. And for many people around the world, they think, why do you even want to stay? I mean, they really think that we are so desperate, or Gazans are just so desperate to get out of that hellhole. It actually is not true. Yeah, some people want to leave to go to be united with their families, to go and get some medical treatment, to join their universities, and that's completely normal. But as a community, as a collective, they are not desperate to leave Gaza. They love Gaza, not because of the stones and the physical, tangible components of Gaza, but rather because of the representation of Gaza, the community of Gaza, the mosque of Gaza, the people of Gaza. That's why I felt like that cover really sums it up so beautifully, that if I am to visualize Gaza in a single picture, it would be that.
In this edition of the magazine, Ramzy writes about how Gaza's history of resistance goes back much, much further than the creation of modern-day Israel. Thousands of years back, in fact.
Gaza has fought against Alexander the Great, along with his Macedonian army. Gaza was the last city that he needed to conquer on the eastern Mediterranean shore, and he couldn't. So he besieged Gaza for 3 months, and this is so strange because Gaza's topography is not made for war. It's a coastal flat area. How did Gazans fight Alexander? They actually built mounds of dirt and hills around their city and fought him for months. And they managed to push him back for such a long time. Eventually, he conquered the city. The leader of the Palestinian resistance back then was named Batis or Batis. It's hard to pronounce it, but it ultimately Batis was tortured and killed in the most savage way possible, and Gaza was conquered to rise again and again and again. They fought Napoleon. They were stood in the way of Napoleon Bonaparte. The places you hear right now in the news, especially Shuja'iyya, the place where Israel has tried to conquer numerous times, Napoleon had tried to conquer numerous times as well. And then when the English tried to occupy Gaza during in the war with the Ottomans and all of that, Gaza was still there. Gaza has been there fighting. It is something that we do. Gaza doesn't aggress upon anybody. Gaza doesn't invade anybody. But when Gaza is invaded, they fight, and they fight until the very end. In Arabic culture, we have this saying, حتى آخر نقطة دم, meaning until the last drop of blood. It's supposed to be a metaphor. It's really not supposed to be, in kind of carried out in practice. But Gaza is actually made that happen. They fought in many of these battles until the last drop of blood. But when I say they fought, I'm not just talking about the fighter himself alone. I'm talking about the community. Without that community, the war would have been over a long time ago. And the Israelis would be whining and dining at the beaches of Gaza as we speak. And settlements, at least the foundations of many of these settlements would have already been built in Gaza. And real estate would be advertised in Israeli newspapers. Jared Kushner would be back and forth trying to select the best place for his resort. And maybe there will be another Trump Tower somewhere in Gaza. But without the Gazans, that did not happen. And that did not happen because the people of Gaza and because the history of resistance in Gaza that really made it impossible, or at least very, very difficult for all invaders to conquer Gaza. And when they did, to sustain their military occupation of Gaza.
We've been talking about the history, but in the keynote that you wrote for this issue, it's called The Long War for Meaning. And you write, this war of words may be even more vital than the struggle on the ground. It is a struggle for cultural and intellectual legitimacy, a battle to define reality itself. So I wanted to talk about how you see the importance of language, of narrative, and of words.
I talk to my cousins. I have lost over 110 family members in Gaza, including my sister. And that's like when I stopped counting like a year ago. There was like no point. Why are we counting? All of Gaza is our family anyway. But the thing is, like, my surviving cousins and relatives, when they call me, they always ask about me, about my family. How are you doing? And I was like, me? I'm fine. How are you doing? Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. Thanks to Allah. And then they kind of move on so quickly as if they are not living in a genocide. There is something, I feel like the statement that Gazans are made different or something to that effect, I think it's an understatement. I think there's something so powerful about Gaza. I have been writing about Gaza's history for 20 years now. Most of my books have focused on Gaza, although people's history of Palestine in general. But I'm still at awe. I'm still astonished by what Gaza is able to produce. They are living in a completely wasted, physical space. Everything is destroyed. Nothing is standing. Yet somehow they still find ways to educate their children in tents. they have, doctors go from one tent to the other checking on people. They still find a way to entertain their children. They still find places and ways to pray and do everything else. It's like as if society is not really, it's not structure. Society is not structure. Society is the people that made it what it is. And it's like there is a collective understanding and a collective agreement among Palestinians that under no circumstance they will let go of their civilization, of their humanity. And that's where the intellectual production comes from. I have been arguing, and many have been arguing, particularly Palestinians, that we don't need someone to tell our story on our behalf. We are not a liability to our own narrative. We shouldn't be marginalized because we are not very credible in the eyes of Western media. The Zionists are way too clever and they have already tainted you Palestinians, so why don't you just sit and listen and let someone else do the talking on your behalf? Israel did not allow international journalists to go to Gaza, and that meant that Gaza was left alone for 2 years. And yet, Gaza has developed ways to channel its intellectual production, whether in the form of poetry and art and political discourses and journalism and media and everything else, completely on its own, in a way that managed to defeat Zionist propaganda that's been going on for over 100 years. They are capable of doing it themselves. And as a result, the Israelis went after the intellectual producers. They went after the academics, hundreds of professors, hundreds of teachers, thousands of students being killed. Nearly 300 journalists have been killed, hundreds of influencers and bloggers and so forth and so on. And every time they do it, they think, well, we did manage to, suppress the Palestinian voice a little bit. But then they are surprised that 3, 4, 5 people kind of rise to take the place of their fallen comrade, which means that even the way that Palestinians communicate their stories in Gaza is a communal method of communication.
I remember watching footage of journalists in Gaza coming together every night to eat together and just be together at the end of the day of everything that they've covered, and thinking what a different model that was to Western journalism that's very competitive, that's very individualized, that's doesn't have that communal aspect, and feeling like we really had a lot to learn as journalists from that display of solidarity between them.
It's like kind of going back to the idea that journalism, the way that we were taught at the university, but I've never really seen implemented in everyday life, that journalism is actually a mission. Intellect is a mission. There's a purpose, there's a set of values behind it. We don't see this happening really in many parts of the world, but in Gaza, it's kind of really back to that very raw, basic definition of what media, what journalism is actually all about.
In the issue, you discuss two Palestinian concepts of resistance that I think will be new to a lot of readers. The first is Samud and then Maqawama. And they're terms I wonder if you could tell me what they mean and how they differ, how Palestinians are practicing them in the face of genocide.
Recently, when I speak in public, I tell people, you know what? It's time for an Arabic lesson. There's no way around it. It's very important that you learn certain concepts in their mother tongue, in their original language. We have to learn this word. Muqawama is a societal collective concept, and it expresses itself in numerous ways. I could be writing a poem, and I am practicing some sort of a muqawama. I give a speech, I write, do graffiti, artistic graffiti on the wall, raise a flag, or even engage in armed struggle. They are all forms of muqawama. When the Western outsider, whether the activist or the media or anybody else, look at it from their point of view, they feel like, certain kind of Palestinian resistance might harm their sensibility. And therefore, let's ignore this and let's focus on this. But when you tell Palestinians, they don't know what you're talking about. Muqawama is muqawama. If you followed the prisoners who were released as a result of the ceasefire prisoner exchange, many of them would step outside of the bus the Red Cross bus that would take them mostly to Gaza, but also to Ramallah, and immediately start reciting poetry. Immediately. There was so much poetry that just came out in the last few days from these prisoners. That's a form of muqawama. Another concept is sumud. I mean, we have many Western activists and intellectuals are familiar with the term sumud, and it translates to steadfastness. But what they don't know is that sumud is not a sentiment, it's not a feeling, it's an actual tool. It's a tool that we infuse and we use on a daily basis to survive. It is not something that requires an academic theory, it's something that needs to be understood on the ground of Gaza. So much of what we do is an act of sumud, and what we have seen happening in Gaza in the last 2 years, even by Palestinian standards, it actually took the term sumud from that of being a cultural, societal concept into an actual weapon that allowed society to survive under the harshest of circumstances. Even the term sumud itself, even within its Arabic Palestinian cultural context, needs to be understood a little bit more now and needs to be redefined. There are so many different concepts. Karama means dignity. Dignity is like, if you watch the news on BBC or CNN and they want to compare the arms of the Palestinians in Gaza and the Israeli army, and that this is silly. It's silly. There's no such concept. Palestinians don't have arms that they haven't manufactured from the unexploded ordnance thrown at them by the Israeli army. It's not an army. It's not an army. So, but would CNN and BBC change the lineup of Palestinian weapons? Karama, dignity, hurriya, freedom, sumud, steadfastness, muqawama, resistance, and so forth. These are the things that are channeling the Palestinian people, but quite often we ignore them because it doesn't fit into any basic model of how we perceive wars to be fought. For Palestinians, it's essential. And this is why Palestinian culture is absolutely essential to any truly deep understanding of what is happening in Gaza. The genocide, before the genocide, and what will happen after the genocide.
And I want to talk about some of these specific pieces that are in the issue. So Khalida Jarrah's piece on her experience as a political prisoner.
Israel has released 90 Palestinian prisoners as part of the ceasefire deal with Hamas. Women and children were the first to be freed in the initial phase of the agreement. Well, one of the most prominent of those freed is Khalida Jarrah. She's a leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and an elected member of the Palestinian Parliament. Jarrah was in solitary confinement for months in a suffocating 2 by 1.5 meter cell, which human rights groups compared to a tomb. She's been in and out of Israeli prisons for years because of her membership of a group that Israel considers to be illegal.
I thought, for me, really illustrated this concept of sumud, and she talks about Palestinian women in prison. They're all from different backgrounds, and the way that they organize themselves into a community in prison, and some of that creativity that we discussed earlier. They're dancing, dabgid, singing, doing reading groups. They're even producing their own internal news bulletin. And she calls it building a life within a life. And it made me think about what role women in particular have played in Palestinian resistance and, up until now.
I would say that Palestinian women have been the backbone of Palestinian resistance for generations, from the very, very start. I mean, the story of my grandfather being pushed out of his village, yet his ability to navigate his family to some degree of safety and educate his children. I mean, that did not happen because of my grandfather, Muhammad. It largely happened because of my grandmother, Zainab, who was illiterate, by the way. The same thing applies to my mother, who was also illiterate, yet she managed to educate all of us, including my sister, who became a doctor and who was assassinated in Gaza during the genocide. My sister was a particularly interesting story because she was one of the first doctors in the Gaza Strip, female doctors rather, in the Gaza Strip. And around her, she created this kind of power hub, basically, of women. supporting them, helping them, and until you ended up with a generation of a large number of Palestinian women in the medical field in the Khan Yunis area in southern Gaza. And it really all started with 2, 3 women who at one point came and just kind of took a whole community along with them. Khaled Jarrar is a perfect representation of this. She actually managed to create several cohorts of women who received their high school diplomas in prison and then eventually got their college degrees. She fought with the Israeli prison administration. She contacted various Palestinian universities in the West Bank. She made she created a miracle from behind prison cells, to the point that when the Israelis realized that there's a sense of community happening there, they confiscated their blackboards and their chalks and their books and everything. So what did Khaleda do? She started utilizing the glass windows wherever it's found, or the doors in the cell or the walls of the cell, to actually write and educate women on math and Arabic and English and the rest of the subjects. And the thing is, when I contacted her to talk about her experience in prison, honestly, I was hoping that she's going to be talking about ideology, socialism, and all of these, and feminism, and all of these things. She didn't. Was disinterested. She wanted to talk about the women that managed to get together, to work together, to create teachers from amongst themselves, and for 4 or 5 cohorts of women to be educated inside their prison cells. So this is the beauty about the role of women in our society, is that there is no ideological fanfare that comes with it. There's not much lecturing and speeches. There's no TED Talks or anything of that nature. Just women at work.
A few days ago, dock workers took action to block the transport of weapons to Israel. 2 containers that were supposed to transit through the port were refused entry because of their contents.
My next question is about a piece called Ports of Resistance by Romano Rubio. She writes about Italian dock workers that are striking and blockading military cargo in solidarity with the Palestinians, and another piece by Ronnie Casriels on the links between anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa and the fight for Palestinian liberation called From Darkness to Light. How important are these actions, these international solidarities? How important have they been? How important will they be going forward?
Extremely, extremely important, not only just for Palestine, but also for these very societies. There were 2 million people per day marching in the streets of Italy. And Italy is not a huge country. To have 2 million people marching from Milano to Sardinia and Sicily, and of course in Rome and everywhere else, it was just, it took Italians by surprise, and it revitalized the unions. Now the unions the unions are the ones who started the whole thing. The dock workers in Geneva and elsewhere that began this, and then started putting actual political demands for the government to take a stance, to recognize Palestine, to stop giving Israel weapons, particularly the company Leonardo. And I believe Romana Rubio spoke about this at length at her essay. And these unions eventually became the organizers of the entire society, to the point that the Prime Minister, Meloni, is now scared. She is afraid that she is going to end up paying a political price for her support for Israel. I think she would have thought this is unthinkable before the genocide. How important is Gaza anyway to Italian politics? Suddenly it is important. Now, Ronnie Caswell's piece is it has particular significance because of the relationship between the South African struggle and Palestine. Ronnie Caswell himself was, the leader of the underground resistance in South Africa, a very close comrade to Nelson Mandela, later became the Minister of Intelligence in the country, and is the leading South African activist for Palestine. And Ronnie Caswell's, his piece is uplifting in a sense, because he tells you this is Palestine's movement. Palestine is there. We have always, as Palestinians, been talking about, when are we going to get our South Africa moment? And it's there. Ronnie is telling us it's there, and he provides in his essay reasons to elucidate, to explain why the Palestinians have reached that specific movement, what he called the second wave of decolonization. And that's why the Israeli apartheid is as doomed as the South African apartheid was doomed before it. It's an uplifting piece, very, very important piece, because it's situated within actual, real, lived personal experiences.
Talking of the future of Zionism, I have to ask you, because we're living in this moment of the ceasefire and in the days just immediately after it, to get your reaction and your feelings on the last few days.
I think it's important for people to understand that even before the genocide, Gaza was occupied by Israel. According to the legal definition, international law, Gaza was always occupied by Israel. So even after Israel supposedly left Gaza, they merely deployed out of Gaza in 2005. But Gaza continued to be, from a legal point of view, occupied by Israel. Now, the Israelis are still in about 50% of Gaza. They might go a little bit further towards the so-called border, which is the so-called security zones dividing Gaza from Israel, or they might stay a little bit longer. It doesn't change the status. Israel is still in occupation of Gaza. What really matters is that we do not allow Israel to basically determine or convince us that the war is over. We shouldn't allow the likes of Donald Trump to speak about, oh, this is the greatest peace ever, and what happened is a peace deal. It's not a peace deal. When you have 250,000 people between dead and wounded, and when you have thousands of people decomposed under the destroyed rubble of Gaza, and when you don't have the right of return for the Palestinian refugees honored, and you don't have international humanitarian laws respected, and you still have Israeli siege and Israeli military occupation, and Israeli apartheid system, and Israeli walls, and Israeli settlements, and Israeli settlers. Once all of these things still there, nothing has changed. It's not peace. So the international community, the civil society globally, needs to understand that their job is not finished. We are merely getting started. We need to keep pushing now so that Israel may become the pariah state that it should have always been, and that the Palestinian people cannot be left alone. And if Zionism wins, there is this new precedent that for the rest of the world, all dictatorship, all oppressors, all military juntas, everybody who's violating human rights would say, well, I have hope too, if the Israelis manage to pull this off. So we are not just doing this for Gaza and Palestine, we are doing it for the rest of humanity. Because if Gazans are able to fight back, anyone and everyone can do so individually and collectively all over the world.
That was Ramzy Baroud, the guest editor of the October-November issue of New Internationalist magazine on Gaza. Ramzy is a journalist, historian, and the author of many books, including The Second Palestinian Intifada, A Chronicle of a People's Struggle, These Chains Will Be Broken, and Our Vision for Liberation with Ilan Pappé. He is also the editor of the PalestineChronicle.com. This episode was hosted by me, Decca Muldowney. I'm a co-editor at New Internationalist. My co-editors are Amy Hall, Conrad Landon, Nick Dowson, and Bethany Riley. Maxine Betteridge-Mose is our digital editor, and our editorial assistant is Paula Lacey. Our theme music has been produced by Samuel Raphael Williams, and our logo design is by Mari Foos. Audio editing is by Nazik Hamza. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.